Hey guys, it's your boy Otaku Phil here. So I had a good question today. Someone had asked me if I could simplify pivot turning. Now, if you've never driven a big vehicle before, you might not be familiar with what pivot turning is. So if you've driven a long vehicle or a big vehicle, pivot turning is basically compensating for the size of the vehicle and what's called the off-tracking effect that happens when you're driving a long vehicle and you're cornering, turning, cornering, maneuvering around an object. So the important thing to remember is, first of all, you have your reference point. So whenever you're doing a turn, a reference point is a point on the bus that when you're driving, you will use this point to know that your vehicle will clear an obstacle or any sort of obstacle when turning. For example, in the buses that I drive, if you're making a left turn, you're going to use your left shoulder, beam the object that you want to clear. So if I was making a left turn into a left lane, I want to put my left shoulder at the beginning of at the outside of the left turn, and when I start making that left turn, it'll put me straight into it. Now on my right hand side, for my vehicle, it is the first set of seats. So if I'm making a right hand turn, if I'm set up at the proper distance, I can look at my seats on the right hand side, and once I clear the obstacle, once that reference point clears the obstacle that I want to turn around, I initiate the turn, and I know that it will get around that turn. So the first thing you should know are your reference points. Your reference points will give you a basis as to when you should turn. All right? So when you're driving, that's the first thing that you're going to always be looking at. Now, the second thing you're going to be looking at is called your pivot point. So the pivot point is the part at the rear of the bus or the rear of the large vehicle, any sort of vehicle, in which the vehicle will literally pivot around, and when you are at that pivot point, you know that in the pivot point in the rear, you can clear an obstacle that you are turning around. Now, this will come in different situations. So let's say I'm making a left turn and there is a center intersection or a center divider. Before I can make that left turn, even if that left turn is clear to my shoulder, I want to look behind me to my pivot point. So if I turn and if I'm before that pivot point, I will not clear that central divider. Okay? So I have to look at that pivot point. If I'm past that pivot point, I know I can clear it. If I'm at or past that pivot point. Now this will come in handy when you're clearing vehicles, when you're making certain turns. You got to know your pivot points. So again, pivot points are different for each bus, or they're different for each vehicle, period. When I was training at our school, we had like 3 or 4 different buses that were, older MCIs, newer MCIs, older and newer Prevost, and each one of them had a different reference point and a different pivot point. Okay? So where pivoting comes in is a concept of what's called off-tracking. Off-tracking is in which you have 2 sets of tires, and as those sets of tires are turning, they make different paths. So I'll show you here exactly what off-tracking means and how you compensate and how you work with it. Alright guys, when it comes to off-tracking, first you got to see what off-tracking is. So what I like to use, that's an easy thing to use at home, is a universal remote. So if you have a long remote that's like this, and as you can see, this remote I have pretty big hands, but it pretty much is a little bit bigger than my hand, is the size of the remote. So the trick is to get a better understanding of off tracking is to use the remote as if you were driving a long vehicle. So what I like to do is I like to take, two fingers and grip a side of the remote, typically the front end, and I'm going to imagine that these are my front wheels on my vehicle. All right? This piece of paper is going to be an obstacle. It's going to be either a corner or, a sidewalk or whatever. So, if you're in a car, your wheelbase is tighter. So when you're in a car, you make a turn, you have a small amount of off tracking. So off tracking is basically when the front and the rear wheels take a different path. So if we were to simulate this was a bus or any large vehicle and we want to go around this obstacle, if we were to turn the wheels and start maneuvering the vehicle around the corner immediately, as soon as the front wheels clear it like we would in a car, what's going to happen is as I start turning the vehicle, I'm going to hit that obstacle. Why? Because even though the front of the bus is clearing the obstacle, the rear tire is not following the same path. It wants to take the inside path, which is tighter than the outside path. That's called off tracking right there. All right? So, how you compensate for off tracking is by using your references and a pivot point. So, what you want to say is, first learn your reference points and learn where your pivot point is. So let's say the pivot point is about where my rear tires would be, maybe a little further front or a little rear. I find with especially buses, it's typically either slightly in front of the rear tire or at the rear tire. It's typically in that region. So what we would do is we would have to compensate our turn by extending it in order to clear this object. So we already know we can't turn directly in as soon as the front clears. We're going to hit our object. So what you have to do is you have to extend the distance before you begin your turn. Move over here a little better. We have to extend the distance of the front of the bus and then start turning. And as we turn, even though we have we create a wider radius for the outside of the bus to clear, our inside path of the rear tires just barely misses the object. So we know that we have to bring it out, let's say here, and then as we turn, it just clears it. So this point in which your vehicle just clears this part is called the pivot point. When it just clears it, anytime you maneuver that bus, you can know that it will pivot around this point. All right? So you have different situations on the pivot point. And even the pivot point varies from even each side. And so does your reference varies from each side. So that means that if I was making a left, let's say I'm making a left turn. So let's say this is a center median here. I'm making a turn here. Obviously, the lane I want to get to is over here. I'm not just going to do this huge turn in and I'm hitting the object. So the lane's here. I'm trying to get over here. I'm making a left turn. I need to clear close to that same pivot point, then start making the turns to come in. All right? So that's a basic concept of the pivot point. When you're doing pivot point training, it's basically all about controlling the path of the rear of the large vehicle, controlling the path of the rear of the vehicle, and obviously controlling the outer path because you don't want to get slammed into a car. So you got to find that happy medium in which you clear the pivot point, and once you clear that pivot point, you know that you can line that bus up into where you want to get it. That means you're going to have to take a wider turn on the outside, know your reference points, and know your pivot point. And the pivot point works in all different situations. So let's say this is another obstacle, maybe it's a bus, and I'm parked next to a bus. All right, I'm parked next to a bus. The bus is often parked at an angle. All right, so we're typically at an offset angle. If I need to come back and line up this way. If I just start turning my tires immediately, boom, I'm going to hit that bus. But if I bring the bus back to that pivot point, so we found that pivot point on this guy is about the 9, and I start turning the wheels. All right, we'll do it with the other hand so you can see it better. So we know the pivot point on this remote is about where the 9 is. I'm bringing it back, and I start turning it as if where the front wheels are. It's going to clear that obstacle. So that's the importance of knowing your pivot point and knowing where to adjust it. Okay? So the important thing is to double check where your pivot points are. Make sure you, your instructor, your specific vehicle will have a specific pivot point. So know where that pivot point is. Make sure you are constantly referencing. And when you're making those turns, you're going to have to constantly adjust. You're going to have to, not all turns are the same. You may be a little closer to the curve, and that's going to cause you to extend your reference point. You may be a little farther. You can decrease your reference point. Once you start making that turn, you're going to look where you're going, obviously, to make sure you're not running into a vehicle that's in front of you, and you're going to look at your pivot point to make sure that you're clearing. So you should be constantly scanning in front of you, looking at your convex mirror, looking at your flat mirror, double checking your reference points, double checking the tail. It's all about controlling the rear of the bus. So if you're lined up your reference properly, you lined up your pivot point correctly, the rear of the bus should clear that deal. It's not a difficult thing. It can be a little difficult to grasp when you first start, but after a while, it's not that big a deal. You won't even think about it. You'll just know, boom, I'm at that point. I'm going to start turning. You're going to be glancing at where you're going. You're going to be glancing at the back of your bus to make sure that it's clearing, and it's just going to be another day. So that's basically how pivot points work. If you guys have any more great questions like this, just let me know. I love demonstrating it, and trying to help you guys understand it. So your boy Talk with Phil. I'll talk to you guys.